Welcome you here all today. My name is Rita Brown and I'm the chair of the Australian BPD Foundation, and I'll be handing over to one of our directors, Mike Hazelton, who will be facilitating today's session. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Rita. And welcome everyone to this webinar. As you just heard, my name is Mike Hazelton. I'm a conjoint professor at the University of Newcastle. I'm president of the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses and a director on the board of directors of the Australian BPD Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on reconsidering how we think about brain biology in borderline personality disorder, which is being presented by Dr. Anthony Ruocco. As we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we are meeting today, both from within Australia and overseas, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Awabakal people, that is Newcastle and the Hunter region of New South Wales, and you might like to indicate using the chat function where you are joining the webinar from. A very quick introduction to the Australian BPD Foundation, launched in 2013. We're a group of volunteer consumers, carers and clinicians who are passionate in encouraging a positive culture around borderline personality disorder and promoting the ready availability and accessibility of appropriate services for everyone impacted by BPD. We are a registered charity by the ACNC and all donations are tax deductible. BPD Awareness Week in Australia is in the first week of October, and we have a number of events planned. Since May is BPD Awareness Month in the USA and the UK, and with the aim to increase awareness in Australia, we are hosting this event today, and we're really delighted that Anthony's able to join us. It's great to see people attending from all over the country. Shortly, I will invite Anthony to make his presentation. Once he is finished, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. If I could ask you that you use the chat function to pose questions, I will then collate and facilitate discussion. It's expected that the duration of the session will be around about 1.5 hours in total. It's now a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Ruocco. Anthony is a professor, graduate chair and director of clinical training in the Department of Clinical Science at the University of Toronto. He's a licensed psychologist registered with the College of Psychologists of Ontario. He completed his PhD in clinical psychology, neuropsychology track at Drexel University and his pre-doctoral internship in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Chicago. He has a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Cognitive Medicine at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and completed a concurrent postdoctoral residency in clinical neuropsychology at the Department of Psychiatry, the University of Illinois Medical Center at Chicago. He's recognized for his research on neurocognitive, social cognitive and neuroimaging studies of borderline personality disorder, including family studies, investigations of brain structure and function, and the impacts of psychotherapies and brain stimulation treatment on symptoms, cognition, and brain function. Again, many thanks to everyone for attending. We will be sending you a link so you can upload the recording of today's session as soon as we're able to after the completion. And again, once a massive thanks to Anthony for being available, and please join me in showing your appreciation.
All right, well,
over to you, Anthony.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the wonderful introduction, Mike, and thank you, Rita, for inviting me to be here today. So if you hear a little bit of a ding-dong on my side of things, it's just people entering the waiting room, so you can just disregard that. Hopefully not people coming to my door and interrupting the presentation. So again, my name is Anthony Ruocco, and I'm going to be speaking today about my research on brain biology in BPD. And so I'm happy to be presenting during what is BPD Awareness Month in the United States. And in Canada, we have the Sash Bear Foundation, which some of you may be familiar with, which actually holds a walk here in Toronto at the Sunnyside Pavilion, is I believe what it's called, to kind of take a walk on the boardwalk in order to raise money for people with BPD and emotion dysregulation. So when thinking about my presentation today, Rita really kind of helped me to refine the way that I might think about brain biology and to talk about my research with this group, because I've really been thinking a lot more about the concept of kind of strength-based interpretations and understandings of BPD, including when it comes to brain biology. And so you'll see that if you're somebody who maybe attended a workshop that I presented at the University of Wollongong in November of last year, you might see some of the same slides, but perhaps a little bit of a different interpretation when we think about these brain biology research findings from just a slightly different perspective. So for today, I'm going to start out by reviewing the clinical diagnoses and symptoms that are associated with BPD. I understand that I believe it's primarily an audience of clinicians, and so probably more of a review than anything. And I'm going to use that to kind of then lead into the types of brain biology research that tend to have been done in the area of BPD, and really talk about the interpretations of these research findings from a strength-based perspective. What are the advantages or adaptive qualities of some of the behavioral performance findings and the brain biology kind of structural and functional activation findings in BPD. And then I'm going to end with talking about neurodevelopmental factors. I understand that many people might be interested, especially in the concept of neurodiversity and the overlap between BPD and maybe aspects of neurodevelopment, thinking about things like learning disorders, autism spectrum disorder. There isn't a lot of consistent research on that topic, but I'd like to actually end with more of a question about whether BPD might be considered along this kind of spectrum of neurodiversity, especially when considering the brain biology and social perception research findings that I will be discussing. So to make sure that everybody is on the same page, I'd like to briefly talk about, well, what is borderline personality disorder? And as many of you probably already know, the term borderline personality disorder can be confusing to many people. I've had many people who have been given this diagnosis. I've heard from them that they can be quite confused about what it really means. Does it mean that I have a personality disorder and that I'm at the borderline of having a personality disorder? And I think that the name can be quite confusing. It's not as obvious as something like depression. So where does this borderline label come from? And so many people have written about, historically, that borderline comes from the idea that it represents a borderline state or condition between things like psychosis and neurosis, mood disorders and identity disorders, depressive symptoms and impulsive symptoms. And so what we see then is the label borderline given to this kind of overlap between two states or conditions. And what everybody probably also knows is that today in the DSM-5, we see borderline as a personality disorder. And there are 9 specific symptoms of the disorder that I'm not going to review because I'm not sure they really are going to aid in the interpretation of my findings that I'm going to present today. But what I do want to do is actually highlight that factor analytic research of these different symptoms really is consistent with the description, this more general description that's provided in the DSM-5, which is that there is a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affects or emotional expression, and marked impulsivity. So factor analytic research actually suggests that there may be 3 kind of core domains of symptoms in BPD, one being this interpersonal and identity-related factor that they call disturbed relatedness, an emotion dysregulation factor, and an impulsivity or behavioral dysregulation factor. And in today's presentation, I don't have time to go through every one of these different factors in terms of brain biology research, but you'll see in a moment that I'm going to review this research, especially in the areas of emotion regulation and behavioral dysregulation. But before I go into that research, I always like to start out by talking about some really key considerations that I especially want to convey to people who have BPD or their family members or carers, but also, of course, to clinicians. And one of these key considerations is that the causes of BPD are multiple and complex. It's quite common that I hear from people who are curious to know and perhaps even concerned about whether a loved one, so if they have if their partner, for example, has BPD, and they're curious to know if their biological child, might go on to develop BPD. And so that's an understandable question, but it's really hard to make any firm conclusions at the level of an individual, and that includes what might have caused or be causing the development of BPD. We know that it's complex and can differ widely from one person to the next, and that includes both genetic and environmental factors. And when we think about genes and environment, we really can't pinpoint to what extent genes versus environment play a role in the development of BPD for any one person or for any one family. So that's really important to keep in mind when we think about these research findings. And the intention of much of the family research that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to kind of put in a few slides about my family research, because it really helps us, as you'll see in a moment, helps us to better understand not just risk, like genetic or biological risk for potentially developing BPD, but it also helps us understand resilience. And many people, well, the vast majority of first-degree biological relatives of people with BPD actually don't go on to develop BPD. And so understanding, the biological factors and environmental factors that might play a role in that is important to also understand aspects of resilience. And so you'll see from my research that my intention in my family research is not to ascribe blame, but instead to offer hope and promise for identifying what might be some of the inherited biological factors that play a role in BPD, their interactions with the environment, and then hopefully intervening early to prevent or lessen the severity of BPD, and to hopefully prevent, any suffering or disability that might be associated with BPD. So I'm going to present a few slides in a moment about my family study of BPD, but why does this matter? I think that this brain research on families, as I said earlier, is interesting because it can help us understand resilience. What are some of the biological factors that maybe represent a resilience toward, not developing disability and mental health concerns. And it also, though, kind of on the surface, also gives us some insights into what the lived or living experiences of family members might be. It also helps us as researchers to identify other factors beyond symptoms alone, which is often what is talked about when people ask me about BPD. Is my child going to develop BPD? Well, we know that there are other factors that play a role in the development of BPD, and some of them are biological, or they appear to be biological at least. And so thinking about what role that might play is important as well, because we can only go so far studying people with BPD. We also need to understand people who have a genetic relationship and understand those characteristics, because they're also important and can provide complementary information. Now, I also just want to put a face to a family in Toronto. They are the founders of the Sash Bear Foundation. You may recognize Lynn Coury here, her husband and daughter, and this photo that they're holding up of Sasha Menu Coury, who unfortunately died by suicide. And out of that tragedy in this family, we see the establishment of the Sash Bear Foundation, which actually has played a major role in helping to facilitate the research in my laboratory on the brain biology of BPD and its role in families. If anybody's interested, you're welcome to look them up. They do really excellent work to assist and help people with BPD and emotion dysregulation, suicidal thoughts, and behaviors more broadly. Okay, so before we talk about the brain biology research, I just have 2 or 3 slides about what are the types of symptoms and diagnoses that we see in people with BPD. If we know that BPD is characterized by an instability in kind of emotional expression, in behavioral regulation, in how people with BPD view themselves and the world, what are some of the diagnoses and symptoms that go along with BPD? Well, if we look, for example, within families, we see some interesting results. One of the reasons that we really care about biology is that there seems to be about a 40% heritability of BPD within families, meaning that we look at more BPD symptoms and traits, that about 40% of the variation in BPD in the population is attributable to variation in genes rather than environmental factors. So this causes us to think that perhaps we can study families as a way to better understand biological factors that might be heritable across generations. And so when we think about diagnoses, what we see that I think is quite interesting is a very consistent set of studies that show that depression is something that tends to be common in relatives of people with BPD, as well as what people call impulsive spectrum diagnoses. So substance use disorder is an example of that. So what this suggests is that there might be some evidence kind of at the surface behavioral symptom level that emotional and impulsive related disorders and symptoms play a role in BPD, including the familial risk for BPD. And so this also comes out when we look at symptoms or personality traits, that emotion dysregulation and impulsivity really seem to run in families. So we ran a family study in Toronto that recruited 99 people with BPD that I'll also be calling probands. Just over 100 of their first-degree biological relatives. These were primarily parents and siblings with a small number of children, as well as controls that didn't have a history of BPD in their first-degree relatives. And what we could do then is do different sorts of cognitive testing, so testing of thinking abilities, of social perception, and of brain activation to better understand what might be some of the biological factors that play a role in BPD. So, not surprisingly, in our family study, we found consistent with other research that there was a strong history of depression, of alcohol dependence, of anxiety. We also saw some evidence of higher levels of trauma and trauma-related disorders that we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment or toward the end of my presentation, what roles stress and trauma might play in the development of BPD and interact with brain factors. So given the high prevalence of emotion-related disorders and symptoms in BPD, one aspect of brain biology that has been studied probably the most frequently across the world is emotion dysregulation. And later I'll be talking a little bit more about behavioral dysregulation. And today we won't get into disturbed relatedness, or I'll be here until midnight Toronto time. But you might be able to find actually different presentations of mine online that talk a little bit more about that. So why emotion regulation? Many people, I'm sure, have heard a lot about emotion regulation, especially given that it's such a big target for many of the evidence-based treatments for BPD, such as dialectical behavior therapy. We've done some research looking at emotion regulation in BPD, and I won't go into all of the details, but we have found some really interesting evidence that when it comes to the strategies that people with BPD use to regulate their emotions, they tend, unfortunately, to be using a lot of different strategies. They don't tend to necessarily be effective at regulating the emotions in the way that people with BPD would like to have their emotions regulated. And it might be because of the types of strategies that they use. They might be kind of trying to suppress the emotion, ruminate. They might be ruminating, really thinking about the emotion, maybe even avoiding the emotion. And that when they use these more frequently, they tend not to be as effective, generally speaking, as these other strategies that unfortunately people with BPD tend to use less frequently, even though there's more evidence to suggest, at least in people without BPD, that these are more effective at regulating emotions. And they include things like cognitive reappraisal, which means kind of thinking about a situation in a different way to change your emotion. So thinking about something more positively or in a different way. Engaging in more of a problem-solving approach to be able to kind of regulate that emotion in a more effective manner. And what many people may have heard about in the past, which is this kind of acceptance, this kind of non-judgment of emotions and being willing to experience emotions. And in our research, we've been very interested in self-harm, for example, but other different types of potentially dangerous behaviors. And what we found in our analyses is that, interestingly, it was a combination of higher levels of rumination, so thinking over and over again about negative things that have happened to that person, and low problem solving, so not really having the flexibility to think about different ways to regulate one's emotion or solve a problem in one's life, actually is associated with engaging in potentially harmful behaviors. And that included self-harm, so self-injury, but also other things like maybe excessive eating or exercise or other things that could potentially in the long run, if done excessively, could be quite dangerous or harmful for that person. So emotion regulation really seems to be very relevant to BPD. And the theory at the level of the brain is that I just presented some information about the difficulty regulating emotions, perhaps because of the emotional regulation strategies people tend to use. But also, on the other hand, at the level of the brain, many people have talked about there being what might be called a hypersensitivity or a heightened sensitivity to emotions. And so actually, 10 years ago now, we conducted a meta-analysis where we combined research across different brain imaging studies in BPD, which tended to use various approaches to study negative emotions. So people went into an MRI and, big set of magnets that scans the brain, and they examined activation at the level of the brain when people just kind of viewed negative facial expressions. They listened to scripts where they previously described a history of abandonment, and then that script was kind of played to them in the scanner while their brains were being, brain activation was being measured. Also, people have asked people with BPD to cognitively distance themselves from the emotional contents of photographs. So that means, if you see a negative emotion in this picture and it invokes, or if you see a picture and it invokes a negative emotion, to kind of think about it differently, try to distance yourself from that emotion. One of the emotion regulation strategies that I talked about just a few moments ago. Separately, but not actually included in this particular study, I wanted to say that some people have also administered painful kind of heat stimuli to people. This is kind of outside of the scope of this presentation, but I wanted people to know that this is something that has also been studied, but the vast majority of research has incorporated these approaches. And when we combine across all these different neuroimaging studies that, again, studied emotions in different ways, primarily negative emotions, what we found was that in people with BPD, on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a little hard to see, but little red blobs that represent higher levels of activation in people with BPD compared to people without BPD. And actually, for the most part, who didn't have any mental health condition. And so, or diagnosis. So what we see on the left-hand side of your screen is higher activation when people with BPD viewed negative emotional stimuli. So like I said, negative facial expressions, negative, scripts about histories of abandonment. And that was compared to neutral emotional stimuli, an event that's not emotionally triggering, or a picture that is just a neutral facial expression. And what we find is higher activation in people with BPD compared to these controls in an area of the brain called the insula. And that part of the brain, one of the things that it's involved in is representing how intensely people experience negative emotions. And this aligns with this theory that I presented just a moment ago, that perhaps there is a biological basis to this heightened level of activation. So, there's this heightened sensitivity to emotions. So yeah, we have this potential biological indicator of heightened emotional experience in BPD, and it's coupled with less activation in blue in people with BPD in areas of the brain that are more toward the front of the brain, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, that tend to be associated with more effortful regulation of emotions. And so this was an interesting finding because it really converged with this theory of a kind of a heightened sensitivity to emotional stimuli or emotional kind of environments, and a lower kind of effortful ability to regulate emotions. Now, we also see some interesting findings in adolescents. I won't go through all of the details here, but one of the few studies that has been conducted using brain imaging in adolescents who are showing BPD traits, we also see a certain pattern of interconnectivity in the brain, but in particular in the amygdala, which is a region of the brain that people probably have heard about and has actually been talked about quite a lot as maybe being an emotion generating center of the brain for people with BPD. But I want to provide a different perspective. So my research didn't actually, in the brain slides I showed you just a second ago, we didn't actually see that the amygdala, for example, was overactive in people with BPD or more active in people with BPD. And one of the reasons that we now think that was the case is that one of the ways that we studied what was more active or less active in people with BPD was to look at neutral situations, especially neutral facial expressions, and compare that to negative expressions. But one thing that started to become clear over the last 10 years or so has been that neutral faces, for example, are not necessarily perceived as neutral for people with BPD. And even using the term neutral, I have it in quotes here because, well, maybe somebody without BPD interprets these faces as neutral, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're right and that people with BPD are wrong when they are perceiving emotional expressions. In fact, there's some research that suggests that when you have a facial expression, for example, like the one that's on the left side of the screen here, which is intended to show a low level of fear in this face, that people with BPD are actually better at recognizing that fearful emotional expression, even though it's quite subtle, than people without BPD. And that when the emotional expression is actually stronger, that people with BPD tend to actually see a different emotion, not necessarily another negative emotion, just some other emotion at higher levels of intensity. So suggesting that there are just differences in how people with BPD perceive, for example, social signals in faces. And this is something that we discovered in our research. We again did this meta-analysis similar to the type of brain research that I showed you earlier, but this time combining ratings that people gave of emotional faces and what are supposed to be neutral faces, at least to people who don't have BPD. And what we found is that the greatest difference between people with BPD and healthy controls, or people without BPD and who themselves didn't have a mental health diagnosis, was that people with BPD were far more likely, as you can see here, to see an emotion in a neutral face that somebody without BPD does not. We also found that people with BPD, when they view faces displaying disgust and faces displaying anger, that they tend to see a different emotion than people without BPD, which is actually quite interesting because it seems that people with BPD might be perceiving something differently in faces that are intended at least to convey, for example, rejection, which is disgust, and maybe threat, which would be anger. So what this might suggest is that people with BPD perhaps are more sensitive to different displays of emotional expressions. They perceive them differently, and there might be some adaptive value to that. Perhaps it's important for people with BPD for their own survival, in a way, to be able to detect subtle displays of emotional expressions in faces that are tending to be more neutral that other people who don't have BPD don't detect. So interestingly, when we talk about family studies, we found a consistent finding. This is a study that was just published 2 years ago from our Toronto BPD family study, where we actually found, so the people with BPD are in green and relatives are in yellow, and our controls without BPD are in blue. What we found was that people with BPD and their biological first-degree relatives were both slower than controls to respond to sad, to sad facial expressions. So for some reason, people with BPD and their relatives, which is really interesting finding, I'm not sure exactly how to interpret it just yet, were both slower to actually process sad facial expressions. And interestingly, they were more likely to identify those sad facial expressions as fearful. So given that we see this both in people with BPD and their relatives, it could suggest an inherited social factor. It could also represent, a type of social learning that occurs in families with BPD. So one interpretation of this finding might be that people with BPD are more sensitive to potential signals of threat, seeing potential fear in faces that are intended to be sad, at least based on people without BPD. And can that have a protective or adaptive value for people with BPD? I would imagine many people might say yes to that. So what might be the brain biology basis of this? Well, I'm not going to go into the details of this study, but I want to say that this is a study that was done with colleagues in Switzerland who studied 45 people with BPD who were actually patients. They were inpatients in a psychiatric ward in a hospital in Basel, Switzerland. They had their brain scanned, and they were shown pictures of faces that were neutral, that were kind of computer designed to show 50% level of intensity of a fearful expression, and then 100% intensity of a fearful expression. So we have this kind of increase from neutral to 50% to 100% fear. So if we think about, threat, we might imagine that people with BPD are maybe more sensitive at a biological level, and maybe this would be to fearful faces, and this might be represented in a certain pattern of brain activation. Unexpectedly, in one kind of part of our findings, we found that people with BPD didn't actually differ from controls on the fearful faces at all, whether they were more subtle or more intense. Where we actually found the greatest difference was on the neutral faces, where people with BPD compared to these controls had higher amygdala activation compared to these controls. So this is a very consistent finding we are seeing across studies over the last several years, and that we don't even really necessarily need, these fearful faces or angry faces to invoke higher activation in the amygdala for people with BPD. And this is likely also for people with other psychiatric diagnoses, although it hasn't been studied as consistently. But this higher amygdala activation might be a biological kind of indicator of an enhanced threat detection system, because the amygdala comes online when it's important to pay attention to something in the environment. And what this might suggest is that people with BPD are especially paying attention perhaps in situations that are more ambiguous, where the facial expression isn't really giving you a clear signal about that person's emotional state, for example. So some people might even think about this as maybe representing what's been called hypermentalizing. So really trying to understand what somebody else is thinking or feeling. So if we rethink this brain biological finding, I tend to see it as an enhanced signal to people with BPD that it's important to pay attention, especially because the signals in the environment are ambiguous. Okay, now I want to turn to behavioral dysregulation. One of the brain imaging technologies that I've used most frequently to study behavioral dysregulation, which many people also call impulse control or impulsivity, is a brain imaging technology called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. The main thing to know about this brain imaging technology is that it's quite cheap, at least compared to MRI scanning. An MRI scan, for example, in Toronto costs about $500 an hour to scan people's brains, whereas this type of a technology that I'm showing you here is on the order of tens of thousands of dollars to purchase. But really, it just uses electricity in the wall, and you can scan lots of people using this technology. What it does is it's cheap in the sense that it uses light. It actually shines light onto the skull, and the light in certain wavelengths of light are absorbed by different colored molecules in the brain. Essentially, what we see is that the wavelengths of light that are shined onto the brain are actually differentially absorbed in blood. And so we can tell which blood under the surface of the scalp is more red, which would be oxygenated blood, so blood that's kind of actively being used, and deoxygenated blood, which is more blue, that's kind of being used for brain activity. And so we can strap this thing over the forehead and actually measure patterns of brain activation while people are doing impulse control related behavioral tasks. So one of those tasks is quite simple. It's called a go, no-go task, where somebody is shown lots of go trials. So on the screen, you'll just see this green circle, and the person is instructed to press the space bar on the computer while, their brain activation is being monitored. And then less frequently, they see a no-go trial or a red circle, which means don't press the button. And over, several minutes of this type of a task. So in our research, we've done this for up to, I think, 20 minutes at a time. We can do longer brain scans using this technology compared to fMRI, which is just more expensive. But what we can do is look at what patterns of brain activation occur when somebody suddenly has to put the brakes on, put on these kind of neural brakes and stop themselves from pressing the button. It actually invokes a pattern of activation in the brain that we know is quite strongly associated with stopping or not going. So I'm going to just jump into some interesting findings that I think demonstrate the resilience of people with BPD and their family members. In particular, I'm talking here about family members when they're doing this task and their brain activation is being measured using this technology. This is a study we published 2 years ago now. Again, the same family study that I talked about earlier. And what we did was we looked at people with BPD, controls who didn't have a psychiatric diagnosis, and their first-degree biological relatives of people with BPD. When people were having to put the brakes on and not press the button for those red circles, what we found overall was that people with BPD showed less activation. In fact, we found that they showed deactivation. There was a reduction in activity going in oxygenation within these regions of the brain, in the front of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex. And in particular, there is strong research to suggest that the right prefrontal cortex is strongly associated with that kind of putting the brakes on. In our controls, we found kind of a combination of activation, of lower activation and higher activation. But what we expected was that there would be higher activation, that people without BPD and with no personal history of a psychiatric diagnosis would show kind of a robust pattern of activation, of increase in brain activation in this control region. What we didn't expect was that relatives, despite having this kind of what many people would call a familial risk for BPD, don't show the same type of pattern as people with BPD. In fact, they show the exact opposite pattern. We see heightened levels of activation across the entire prefrontal cortex when they are inhibiting a response. And I've discussed these findings actually with a group in New York City called Families for BPD Research. They fund research grants through the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation in the United States. I've received one of their grants for a different study that I'm not presenting here on brain stimulation in BPD. But what you can see is that this higher level of activation is quite interesting. And what some family members have said to me is that they interpret this as needing to be especially highly regulated themselves, especially those who are more in a carer role, in order to kind of help somebody who has BPD regulate their emotions. And so what we might see here is this biomarker of a resilience and an almost ability to better regulate oneself at the level of the brain in family members of people with BPD. And we also found, I know this is a very busy slide with lots of bars, but it wasn't just at the level of the brain activation that we saw strength. What we actually saw was a strength in behavioral performance. I'm not going to go into the details of what all these different bars mean, but as a neuropsychologist, we'll talk more about neuropsychology in a second. But as a neuropsychologist, we give behavioral tasks that ask people to solve problems, to think flexibly, to inhibit themselves, like I showed in that go, no-go task, but we do a lot more than just a few go, no-go trials. We do about a long task with lots of different situations where somebody has to inhibit their behavior. So what we actually found in people's behavioral performance when we compare relatives who don't have a history of a psychiatric diagnosis to controls who also don't have a psychiatric diagnosis and who don't, though, have a family member with BPD, relatives actually performed stronger than our controls in some cognitive domains, in particular in their ability to inhibit a response, so control their behavior, especially when it's quite tempting to press that button, and their ability to think abstractly. And this was combined with a weakness, not necessarily a deficit, but lower performance in being able to solve problems efficiently. So what this suggests is that being a family member of somebody with BPD is associated with primarily strength, frankly, but also subtle weakness or inefficiency in problem solving. So I think it's really important to be thinking about these kind of more strengths in family members, because it's not only represented in brain activation, which is hard to interpret in many ways, but also in kind of concrete, or at least more concrete, behavioral performance as well. I also just wanted to say that we can use these brain imaging findings also to help people with BPD. We actually did a study where we studied self-harm in people with BPD who ultimately went into dialectical behavior therapy. It was a group of about 20 people with BPD who were seen in a well-known, well-established BPD treatment clinic here in Toronto, run by Shelley McMain. Where we saw that people with BPD who were harming themselves actually reduced their self-harm over treatment for the most part. It almost looks over here like in cutting, people increase their cutting. On average, it looks that way, but that was because there were about 2 or 3 people who actually did increase their cutting during treatment, but everybody else either didn't really change or significantly reduce their cutting. But cumulatively, across all the different forms of self-harm, people showed substantial reductions. And we asked them to do the same go, no go task where they have to press a button when they see a green circle and not press the button for a red circle. And what we found was that they did well at pre-treatment and after 7 months of dialectical behavior therapy. So they were always quite good at this task. But what happened at the level of the brain? Well, we found that from pre-treatment to post-treatment, or at least after 7 months of treatment, the treatment actually lasted a year for most people, that lower levels of activation that we saw before beginning treatment, that we also saw in the family study in people with BPD, that actually improved after 7 months of treatment. This talk therapy actually, we believe at least, produced or was associated with increased activation in these exact same control-related brain regions, really offering hope for people with BPD, that I wouldn't want people with BPD or their family members or carers to think that this brain activation is necessarily a life sentence to having less activation in the brain associated with impulse control. In fact, this can change, and you don't need a brain stimulation to produce that change. We can see it through changes or interventions that are not biological. And then another really interesting finding that I'll say quickly, so I can end with neurodevelopment and give a little bit more attention to this concept of neurodiversity, given these findings. But one of the really interesting things that we discovered through this research is that we compared people who are in green here, who actually showed a strong improvement in self-harm after 7 months of DBT, to people who didn't show an improvement or who actually worsened, as I mentioned, after 7 months of DBT. And we compared their activation between these two groups and also from pre-treatment to 7 months of treatment in this control-related brain region. And what was really interesting was that the people who actually ended up doing the best in treatment from a self-harm perspective, at least, so these green bars, had the lowest levels of activation before they went into treatment and actually showed the greatest increases in activation after 7 months of treatment. And unfortunately, those who had the lowest improvement or actually worsened in their self-harm through DBT showed still low levels of activation in that right prefrontal cortex, but it essentially didn't change with treatment. And we saw this same pattern on both the right and the left sides of the brain. So what this might suggest is that patients, these were actually patients admitted to a hospital, with the lowest neural activation in these control brain regions, you might think, some might assume that lower activation is a bad thing. But in fact, it was these people who actually gained the most from treatment and showed the greatest increases in activation. So I think it's very important to think about the capacity that people with BPD have to enact change in their lives and ultimately in their brains. Okay, so I know I don't have a ton of time to devote to neurodevelopment, but I think it's really important to consider, especially given my experience, that people are increasingly interested in what are some of the childhood antecedents of BPD. And I want to highlight 3 components of Dr. Larry Seaver's model of the neurobiology of BPD and kind of what the neurodevelopmental model might be. And it probably won't surprise most people that this is a pretty well accepted way of thinking about the development of BPD. And it is that there are parallel and interacting developmental pathways, and that those pathways are, on the one hand, an individual's neural organization or their brain biology that they come to life with, and that can be altered by the social matrix, and that these two things can actually influence each other. The social matrix, so one's family and caregiving environment can impact neural organization and vice versa. And all of this is kind of the landscape in which development takes place in people with BPD. And that experiences such as abuse, neglect, and stress can alter the brain. And I don't necessarily want to interpret these experiences as maladaptive. Of course, in many ways, they produce symptoms and life experiences that are distressing. But there's also research that some people might be familiar with called post-traumatic growth, that many people experience post-traumatic stress and maladaptive consequences from stressful and traumatic experience, and or people can experience growth from those experiences. So what I like to say is that this can alter the brain, and it can give rise to the development of certain personality traits, and that these traits can also influence relationships with caregivers at first, and then later other people in their lives. And in some individuals, as I said earlier, inheritance might play more of a role, meaning, genetic inheritance, biological inheritance might play a greater role in some people. In other people, more adverse life experiences. And consistent with this theory, a meta-analysis was published 3 years ago, a very important one, I think. I know there's a lot of writing on this slide, but I highlighted what was most important. I think it's pretty definitive. This study found that people with BPD are almost 14 times more likely to report having an experience of childhood adversity than what they called non-clinical controls. So people who don't have their own personal history of a mental health diagnosis. But even compared to people who have other psychiatric diagnoses that are not BPD, we still see that people with BPD are 3 times more likely to report a childhood adversity experience. So there might be something somewhat more unique to the development of BPD that involves childhood stress or adversity, even beyond other people who have other psychiatric diagnoses. If we think about what are the types of childhood adversity that were studied and that seem to be most strongly associated with BPD, they were emotional abuse and neglect. So, when we think about what are some of the common diagnoses that we see in childhood, and I'll talk more about stress in just a moment, but what are some of the diagnoses that many clinicians might be interested in? I know when I was in Wollongong presenting at the Project AIR conference, people were very interested in learning disorders. I won't go into a lot of detail other than to say that there is some controversy, especially in young people who are beginning to show BPD, whether they might have, whether it's appropriate to make comorbid diagnoses, for example, of learning disorder or other diagnoses. I'll talk about autism spectrum disorder in just a second, and ADHD. In fact, I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly on learning disorders, just to say that learning disorder diagnoses can be somewhat more difficult. Personality, including BPD diagnoses, can be more difficult or challenging to make in people with learning disorders because of sensory, physical, cognitive disabilities as they're described in the DSM. So we need to keep that in mind, but there does seem to be some overlap between learning disorders and BPD features, especially impulsiveness and, differences in how people regulate themselves. There is some evidence to suggest that there is a link between poor reading ability, suicidal thoughts and behaviors. It's also important to note, and I'll talk about ADHD in just a moment, that many of these learning disorders co-occur with one another, that these ADHD often co-occurs with anxiety, depression, other behavioral problems. And according to the DSM-5, comorbidities don't necessarily exclude the diagnosis of specific learning disorder, but may make testing and differential diagnosis more difficult. So when we think about cognition or neuropsychology, which is my area of expertise in people with BPD, we should keep in mind that cognition is very relevant to BPD and could be associated with learning disorders, which might, put additional challenges in place in academic contexts for young people and older people with BPD. I'm actually going to skip through this slide because I realize I'm going a little slow and we need to end quite soon. What I do want to highlight are a few things before I talk about whether BPD might fit within the spectrum of neurodiversity. One of the interesting findings that came out of my family research is that even in relatives, we see a relatively high prevalence of different types of neurodevelopmental features that we also see in people with BPD. So in our family study, we found, for example, that the green bars here are the people with BPD, the yellow are the relatives. The people with BPD and their relatives actually reported a pretty high prevalence of having difficulty concentrating in school, which would be consistent potentially with ADHD or a learning disorder. Difficulty sitting still in school, having minor detentions at school, getting at behavioral dysregulation, suspensions, expulsions. So even though we maybe don't necessarily see a very high prevalence of the diagnosis of certain learning disorders, we're starting to see in our research, at least, more of an increased prevalence of, or increased evidence of a higher prevalence of concentration and behavioral control difficulties. And as a neuropsychologist, we study things like attention and working memory and other aspects of cognition that I won't get into today. But our research is definitely suggestive that there might be an increased prevalence of ADHD or learning disorders in people with BPD. We see that there are, for example, there's lower performance in people with BPD on behavioral tests of planning, for example, even visual memory. And although I won't have time to get into it, there is evidence, based on this study that we did here, we published in 2014, actually showing that when we compare people with BPD on verbal versus visual memory tests, there seem to be quite strong discrepancies. And this supports what many people have talked about, just kind of personally to me, about maybe there being a nonverbal learning disability more likely in people with BPD. And a nonverbal learning disability actually has a strong tie, this diagnosis, to a Canadian, Byron Rourke, at the University of Windsor in Ontario, not too far from where I am now, where this diagnosis in children and adolescents is associated with deficits in visuospatial ability, motor impairments, and interestingly, given that I've already talked about this in BPD, an impairment in social skills or perception. So I think it's really important to consider more so as we continue to do research on BPD, what does neurodevelopment look like and how consistent might it be with some of the learning disorders that we are seeing being diagnosed in individuals with this disorder. We also have some evidence, and this is a busy slide, so I'll just summarize it by saying that we're seeing evidence that some of these cognitive abilities are in BPD are actually associated with a measure of childhood trauma. So it's possible maybe that stress and trauma is impacting the brain and cognitive functioning. And we've done some research on this, published very recently, where we've been interested in the hippocampus, a region of the brain that is involved in learning and memory, important academic skills for academics, but it's also involved in the regulation of stress hormones. And so what we've tried to do is understand the link between stress and diagnoses and symptoms and how the hippocampus might play a role in that. Now, I'd like everybody to forgive me because I'm going to skip through to the take-home message of this, which is that in people with BPD and people with depression, which was the sample that we recently studied, and for people who are interested in learning more, you'll see here that we published this just last year in the Journal of Psychiatric Research. What we found was that stress that we measured over the lifetime using a very sophisticated measure, stress was actually associated with not only lower volumes of the brain. So the brain was actually smaller, in people who experienced more stress in their lifetimes. And this is people with BPD, people with depression. But also when we asked people to remember things in the MRI, that the level of activation in the brain was actually smaller. And so this is, or lower. So this is where these blue blobs basically represent lower levels of activation in the brain when people with BPD and people with depression were asked to remember things. And this is kind of interesting because it suggests that people who have higher levels of stress might have greater difficulty, and we actually found evidence of this, remembering things. And so we also looked at patterns of activation specifically within the hippocampus, this region of the brain that's really important for stress regulation. And we find that it's also associated with BPD. And what did we find? We actually found that cumulative stress seems to play a critical role in our statistical modeling when it comes to why people with BPD actually have lower levels of activation in the hippocampus. So cumulative stress might be something that we really need to pay more attention to when we think about why it is that people with personality disorders, including BPD, are more likely to have problems with forgetfulness, are more likely to show lower activation at the brain. Might be because they're experiencing higher levels of stress, and this is playing a significant role. Okay. What I'd like to end with, if people don't mind going an extra 3 or 4 minutes to be able to quickly review these disorders that are kind of considered along the spectrum of neurodiversity, and they are ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. A lot of people have approached me about, this overlap between ADHD and BPD, and there's a great review article that you can see here, and feel free to look up after this presentation on the common ground between ADHD and BPD. And there's a good reason to think there is common ground, because the prevalence of BPD in adults who have ADHD actually ranges from 18 to 34%. That's much higher than we would expect in the general population. And if we look at among adults with BPD, the prevalence of ADHD is up to 42% in childhood. And then when we think about ADHD persisting into adulthood, it's still up to 16%. So why might this be the case? I'm going to skip to this slide that basically shows that there seem to be some core common features between BPD and ADHD that might have a neural basis. For example, emotional instability, the interpersonal things that we see going on, impulsive behaviors. These seem to be common between BPD and ADHD. But what might actually differentiate BPD and ADHD? Well, this research suggests that perhaps certain features of BPD are less common in ADHD, and they might help to distinguish between the two, such as emptiness, non-suicidal self-injury, dissociation, more chronic suicidal behavior is more likely to be seen in BPD. Whereas in ADHD, I would say we still see a lot of attentional deficit in BPD, but the hyperactivity might be more common in ADHD than in BPD. So there's good reason to think that these two have and share a genetic relationship. And if I remember correctly, there is some emerging evidence to suggest that there is a true biological, genetically based relationship between the two, but it doesn't really explain everything. So there are distinguishing features as well as common features. What I can say more confidently, though, is that based on a recent meta-analysis on the overlap between autism spectrum disorder and BPD, is that despite me having heard quite a lot from clinicians and researchers about some differential diagnosis questions around what is BPD and what is ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and the overlap between the two. There was a meta-analysis conducted published 2 years ago, about how much do these conditions overlap. And it seems pretty clear. If we look at ASD on the one hand, BPD on the other hand, the research really only supports an overlap of about 3 to 4%, which is not significantly greater than what we would expect in the general population. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying that we couldn't consider BPD within the spectrum of neurodiversity, but when we think about the overlap between these two categories of diagnosis, there's some overlap, but there isn't a great deal of evidence to suggest that there is substantial overlap beyond what we would expect at the level of the general population. So this brings me to my final slide, which is I've been talking a lot about the brain and cognition, and I'm increasingly asked about, well, might BPD and other diagnoses be considered within this neurodiversity spectrum? So for those who may not be familiar with neurodiversity, I am still really learning and have a lot to learn about what this means to different people and how this might play out at a societal level. But neurodiversity, at least in one definition, because the moment we start to define, we start to exclude. So I don't really want to call this a definition, but at least give people a sense that this refers to perceived variations that are seen in cognitive, which we've talked about, affectual or emotional, and sensory functioning, differing from the majority of the general population, or what some people call the predominant neurotype. That's more usually known as the neurotypical population. And I think in BPD, it's fair to say that we're often talking about people with BPD experiencing cognitive, emotional, and maybe less so sensory functioning that's different from the majority of the people in the population. And so neurodiversity, though, it's important to keep in mind, many of the influential people who write in this space talk about neurodiversity being a trait that's possessed by a group, because we're really talking about diversity, which is differences. So we're talking about not necessarily an individual. People, of course, can identify as neurodiverse, but neurodiversity is a trait that's possessed by a group because it's defined by diversity and differences among individuals. And so we do need to be careful that when we refer to an individual, we're really already identifying them as being different from the norm. But instead, I think it's more helpful to think about people with BPD and others who show neurodiversity as showing differences from each other. And when medical and other standards, oh, sorry, for some reason, my watch is talking to me. When medical and other standards, like societal standards of intellect or cognition, perception, including social perception that I talked about earlier, emotion and emotion regulation are applied to people, deviants then can experience stigma and oppression, which is something that we see a great deal of in the world of BPD and BPD advocacy. So when it comes down to it, I don't have an answer to this question. I would really pose it to those who have experience living with BPD. But are people with BPD situated on a broader continuum of sensory, emotional, and cognitive processing as people who have other diagnoses that have been written as falling on this spectrum or continuum? Autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, which we've talked about, dyslexia or specific learning disorders. I think it's a question that is, left to be answered by those who experience these differences. And I would suggest that it's something that we continue to talk about because it's an important way, I believe, to think about brain biology and cognition, which is also my research area in people with BPD. That maybe thinking about brain biology and cognition and social perception in people with BPD as strengths and adaptive is just as valid of an interpretation of these research findings as one that comes from more of a medical deficit model. So I hope that I've been able to at least begin on this journey with you to talk about the strength of people with BPD, their family members. And I would like to thank in particular people with BPD and their families that have given their time to our research, because we wouldn't have been able to accomplish it without them. So I know I went 11-ish minutes over time, but maybe I'm not too far off considering the introductions. And so I also want to acknowledge the various people who contributed to my research, and I am happy to take questions that people have.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And on my running sheet, you've actually finished right on time. I had you finishing at 11:10. So well done. That was terrific. And I can tell from the questions that have been coming through the chat as you've been speaking that really a lot of people have engaged with what you're talking about. What I might do is just go back through the chat and just pose some of the questions. In one or two instances, I might need to ask people if they would unmute and put the question themselves when we get to them, just so they can have a little more context. So I'll just go back to the first of the questions and we'll just work our way through. So the first was from Emily. Has any research demonstrated changes in brain activation for people with BPD pre and post treatment, for example, after engaging in DBT?
Yes, so there is a good amount of research that has been done on this topic. If you're interested, there was a recent updated review article published recently by an Australian colleague of mine at the University of Wollongong, Ellie Marceau, who invited me to also contribute to this work, but I want to give her the credit. She's the one who really led it. And she actually published the original paper on this, essentially showing there are changes, absolutely, in brain activation in people with BPD after DBT. And the changes are in these more emotion regulatory brain circuits, and they include regions that are actually quite close to the hippocampus. And some researchers in Germany have tried to understand what parts of the brain prior to beginning treatment in terms of their activation and also their structure are most predictive or associated with outcomes after treatment. And unfortunately, this research is based on a relatively small sample size, but it seems that actually the hippocampus and the amygdala, two regions of the brain that I talked about, are among the brain regions that might be most associated with outcomes, so favorable outcomes, people improving through treatment with DBT. There's also some research based on other treatment modalities, for example, transference-focused psychotherapy. There are 1 or 2 studies on that. But so at this point in time, there isn't much beyond DBT, but there is at least some research suggesting change.
Thank you. The next question was from Kel Brooks, and Kel, I wonder if you'd be good enough to unmic and just to ask the question directly.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
We can.
Great. G'day from Brisbane, first of all, over the way in Australia. Was interested to see if there has been any kind of links to the different changes in symptomology over that lifespan then. I didn't quite catch the average age that you had for the participants in your studies, but I'd be interested in seeing or having you elaborate a little bit on the symptoms that you might see with adolescents versus 20s, 30s, up to sort of 50s, 60s kind of thing, because I definitely practice across the lifespan with people with BPD here as well. And I do see a pretty marked difference in symptomology between, say, the 16-year-olds and the 30 or 40-year-olds.
That's a great question. I mean, I have my own biases based on the people that I've seen in Toronto because I've done research with adolescents. It was a bit more of a unique sample, though, because the reason for referral was usually due to kind of problems in school, essentially. And so a lot of the symptoms that tended to be more prevalent were more anxiety, so emotion dysregulation, identity, and identity being one of the areas that I think is pretty challenging for researchers and clinicians probably to conceptualize during a time when there is rapid change, and when there can be a lot of stigmatization around different sexual orientations, gender identities. So I found that as a challenge, when it comes to conceptualizing really what's a symptom in adolescence. So there's actually a fact sheet that's going to be coming out in the next year, probably, where experts in the area of development in BPD are actually putting out kind of facts on this topic of BPD, and one of them is the development of BPD. And at least based on my conversations with these experts, it seems that emotion dysregulation and impulsivity emerge earlier in life. There is a new meta, and so you might see that more prominently in adolescents, I would say. The people that tend to be in my research, almost consistently, the average age is between 30 and 35 years old. We also have, limits on the upper end of our research when we're studying brain activation and cognition, because we don't want to have people who might be experiencing kind of cognitive decline and that sort of thing. So normally we have an upper age limit around 60. So the majority of our people tend to be people who have been living with BPD until their 30s and 40s. Going into older adulthood, I'm actually less familiar with that research. My guess and understanding is that you're probably more likely to see identity and interpersonal problems persisting longer into adulthood. And I haven't read the study yet, but there was a meta-analysis that was just published, I think 2 days ago, that specifically looks at the stability of different personality disorder symptoms over the lifespan. And there is obviously going to be a combination of more state-like symptoms, such as self-harm, and maybe some might say impulsivity, at least based on DSM definitions, and more stability in things like identity and interpersonal functioning. Those would be my guesses, but there is a meta-analysis that would actually give you a more definitive answer to that question that I haven't read just yet. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Cheers, mate.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks. The next question is from Peter, who asks, what are the implications of your research on intimate partner violence generally and specifically perpetrators, uni and or bidirectional, of interpersonal violence who have BPD or personality disorder?
That's a really tough one. The reason I say that is that I've actually had a negative experience once when presenting research like this, where one person it was a recording that I had done where a professor at the University of Toronto had actually asked me, what do you think about supporting people with BPD? And, kind of just asked a question about what can we do to support people with BPD? And somebody kind of, I don't want to say misinterpreted, but interpreted my comment about supporting with people with BPD in a way that was unintended, meaning that, some people with BPD, for example, might be violent. And that we don't necessarily want to support violence or violent people. So I would like to put it out there that when we talk about BPD, obviously the vast majority of people with BPD are not violent. They may be, of course, survivors of victimization. And I don't actually have a lot of research directly on intimate partner violence. When people have talked to us about their experiences of stress, it often was childhood trauma. It was quite uncommon, at least in our research, to have people who endorsed currently or in their adulthood experiencing intimate partner violence. There were a handful of people, but it wasn't more common. When I think about the research, though, my research findings, I didn't present it today, but we have some research findings where even though we gave a measure that took quite a long time for people to complete, that assessed lifetime stress, from childhood into adulthood up to the present time, what we found was that a lot of our biological findings were actually more associated with stress that occurred during childhood and adolescence and not during adulthood. So I'm not necessarily saying that stress during adulthood is not impacting people's brains or functioning in any way, but that from a biological perspective, we're seeing a much stronger effect during early development than of stress and trauma during early development than we are later in life. And that includes the one study that we have published so far is a study actually looking at biomarkers at the level of blood, looking at inflammatory markers, that those were much more strongly associated with childhood trauma than they were adulthood trauma. So good question, and I think something we really need to understand better.
Thank you for that. Look, Kel asked a second question as well. And he was just interested in whether there were other comparisons in relation to treatment protocols other than, say, DBT. So I imagine he's probably thinking of mentalization, for instance.
Yeah, so I don't think there has ever been, but don't quote me on it, even though I'm being recorded right now, that a brain imaging study of MBT. But I did collaborate with colleagues in Denmark. I had a student visit me, Marianne Thompson, to analyze her dissertation data, where we looked at pre and post, I think it was a year of MBT, and we looked at cognition. So we looked at attention. We looked at those sorts of abilities. So not brain correlates of those abilities. And I didn't present it here today. But what we did find is that the attentional difficulties that people with BPD actually displayed on an attention task where they need to press a button over a long period of time, similar to the types of tasks that I mentioned earlier, that the attentional deficits, if we want to call them that were evident compared to controls before they went into MBT, after MBT showed a normalization. So they kind of looked like the controls after MBT. And there was also an increase, if I remember correctly, in kind of their visual perceptual abilities, kind of getting similarly to at some of the findings that I presented earlier. So it was a smaller study, but I think speaks to the potential impact of different psychotherapies on different aspects of cognition and maybe brain biology in people with BPD.
Thank you. I think the next question was from Satya, and he asked, is there any research in people with BPD without a history of trauma with reference to brain changes in comparison to those with a history of trauma?
The short answer is no. I mean, it's a very good question, and I think will help to illuminate, is there a subtype of BPD that might be more associated with a history of trauma versus one that is not? It's a really good question. In our research, where we assessed stress and trauma over the lifespan, and we compared it to people with depression who didn't have BPD, there was definitely a lot of overlap between the people with depression and the people with BPD. But the people with BPD, certainly, there was definitely a subgroup that reported very high levels of stress and trauma over their lifespan. So I think it's a good question to better understand if there's a subgroup that has not experienced trauma and whether they look different biologically. But I'm not familiar with that research, and I think it's important, and a good question maybe for one of my students to start to address in the data that we have. So thank you.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left, and I think we're down to the last 2 or 3 questions. So hopefully we'll get through those while we've still got the time. The next one was the participant was wondering if you can speak to any correlation between attachment and attachment disorder in childhood and later development in BPD.
Yeah, so attachment, is definitely very relevant to personality disorders and especially social functioning. And I'm actually writing a chapter right now on social functioning in personality disorders and the brain biology of that for a textbook on social functioning. And the greatest amount of research that is out there on, so this chapter is actually based on the RDoC, so the research domain criteria in the United States, where they're really interested in understanding social functioning from a biological perspective, and attachment is a big part of this framework that they are applying. And when we look at this framework, attachment is where, the wealth of the research is. And so there's a great deal of research linking, insecure attachment styles to personality disorder traits later in life. Of course, it's not just BPD, it's also associated with other personality disorder traits. And yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of research that has been done that's tried to look at at the brain correlates of like attachment images. So like pictures from people who might be familiar with like the thematic apperception test. People have like kind of used pictures of somebody who is maybe looking like alone or hurt in some way, or something like that. I don't remember the exact pictures that were used, but people have tried to study the kind of the memory process that comes up when people with BPD are kind of shown images that might activate schemas associated with their attachment experiences. There's only one study on that topic that I'm familiar with, at least. And so there's definitely a difference in how people with BPD kind of bring these memories to mind when they're in adulthood, when they're presented with these images. So I can't really speak too much to the brain correlates of it, but one slide that I skipped over in the interest of time actually had to do with memory and how people with BPD actually bring memories to mind when they're in the scanner. And the long story short, which I think gets a little bit at this, is that people without BPD actually activate the hippocampus quite strongly when they remember something in the scanner. Okay. People with BPD, though, seem to use a more distributed network of brain regions and less so the hippocampus. So they activate the brain differently. And that isn't necessarily a problem, but it maybe goes to show that the way that people with BPD are actually engaging their memory networks is different from people without BPD, and could explain maybe why their quality of their memories is different. Our memory task did not include pictures of people in any way. It was indoor and outdoor scenes. But I would imagine, building from that study, if we started to incorporate more attachment relevant images, we'd really start to see what goes beyond kind of general memory functioning and what starts to come online when we start to activate some of these schemas. So nothing yet, but some interesting research going in that direction for brain biology.
There are a couple of additional questions, but time is up, unfortunately. But there is one that I suspect you can answer fairly quickly. I hope I'm right. But Natalie has asked if you can define what you mean by family in the context of your research. Is it genetically related family, or does it include life partners in definition of family? So where there'd be no genetic basis there.
Yeah. So in the context of this research, which I have to be honest, when I started this research, over 10 years ago, family studies were really coming from research on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, where people really thought a lot about the basis and the causes of these disorders as being biological. And so I came to this from that perspective when I started out. And so that is the kind of presumption here, is that we're interested in biological markers, acknowledging that environment plays a role. And because of that, we are studying biological relatives. So these were, in all of my research, it was first degree biological relatives. So parents, siblings, and some children, but primarily parents and siblings. But I'm very interested, hopefully in the next year or so, to do more research that doesn't necessarily involve biological relatives, because I think there's a lot to be learned from other people who are involved in the lives of people with BPD, and that can be learned and can be used to inform kind of psychoeducation and family interventions.
Okay. Look, thanks very much, Anthony, and thanks very much to all the participants. Some great questions and great engagement through the session. A number of people have asked about your slides, whether you'd be prepared to make the slides available in addition to what's been recorded.
Yeah, so I can create a PDF of the slides, and then if people would like, I'll send them to Rita maybe, or to Michael.
Yeah,
that would be fine.
Rita.
Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah.
And the other question is accessing a number of the papers, so some of which are probably more easily accessible than others. Can we follow up with you and perhaps discuss how that might be facilitated?
Yeah, so I have my university website that has links to many of the papers. Everybody may not be able to access all the papers just yet. This is something that I'm working on with the University of Toronto to kind of update my website to put versions of the papers online that can actually be put onto my website. So some will be available, some will not, but I can definitely give you links to where the articles are located. And I'm going to be working on kind of populating that on my website to increase access over the next few weeks.
Great. And second last thing is we do have a survey, an evaluative survey for participants. Rita, I think you are going to put the link for that up, and as people are looking at that, if once again, Anthony, if I could thank you so much for making yourself available. I'm sure it's very dark and somewhat cold where you are now. So it's been fantastic, and I can tell from the feedback coming through the chat that people have been really, really appreciative of your presentation. So on behalf of everyone, many, many thanks.
Great, thank you, and it's nice to be here and see some familiar faces as well.